me go ahead and start. There we go. Recording in progress. Excellent. So again, thank you for joining us for the City of Evanston Municipal Operations Zero Emissions Strategy presentation. I'm going to give folks one more minute. I know we had quite a few registrations, so I don't want to get too ahead of the crowd, but thank you all for joining. For those of you who are already with us, looking forward to this presentation today, and we will be recording it as you heard at the beginning, and we will make the recording and the slides available to the public. We will send out the recording to anyone who's registered for the webinar, as well as the slides or a link to the slides. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We got a lot to cover today. So again, thank you all for joining. My name is Kumar Jensen. I'm the outgoing Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer for the City of Evanston. I've been with the city for 7 years and will be stepping down at the end of the day today, but they've almost gotten to the point of selecting my successor. And so I expect the city will continue to carry on this work, this excellent work that we've been doing over the past couple of years. So if we can go ahead and jump into the next slide, Anthena, I want to talk a little bit about some background information and context to help us understand how Evanston got to this place of developing a zero emission strategy. So back in 2017 and 2018, the city put together a working group to develop a community-wide climate action and resilience plan. And that plan was really focused on charting Evanston's path towards carbon neutrality for the community, but also it had quite a few goals for municipal operations. And not all the goals are just focused on energy use or energy consumption. They varied across many different topics. And they are encapsulated in the first section of the CART plan, which you can see is this document here on the right-hand side of the slides. And then the graph on the left is really helping us understand, since Evanston began tracking its community greenhouse gas emissions, not municipal, but our community greenhouse gas emissions, what that trajectory has looked like. You can see there's been a significant reduction over time. That blue line is the performance line, and that's us charting our pathway towards carbon neutrality as a community for by 2050. And then today we're going to get into detail about what is that pathway, or what do those pathways look like for municipal operations. We'll talk about what portion of the greenhouse gas emissions community-wide are attributable to our municipal operations. So next slide, Anthena. Excellent. So when we look just again at the community, emissions are really heavily in Evanston focused on buildings, and that's primarily electricity use and natural gas consumption, right? They're almost split evenly. There's a small portion that is waste, and that's just disposal and decomposition, and then about 17% that is transportation, which in Evanston we have very fortunate to have very good access in many parts of the city to transportation and transit services. And so that is one reason why we see such a heavy skewing towards our buildings. Next slide. And so in the climate action and resilience plan, there are a set of municipal goals, and then dozens of actions that follow behind those goals. And these goals are contextualized by the fact that of Evanston's community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, about 1% is tied up in municipal operations. And so it's obviously not the highest impact area to focus on, but it is an area that is critical in terms of demonstrating leadership in testing out different processes and technologies. And it's very important for us and for our city staff and stakeholders to make sure that we're walking the walk and we're demonstrating that we as a municipality can do what we would be asking private sector and community organizations to do as well. And so these three goals are the ones that we have been striving towards. And the last one is the carbon neutrality for municipal operations. So that's the framework, or the high level that we've been aiming for in the development of this strategy, that our partners from Elevate Energy and the Center for Neighborhood Technology are going to walk us through today. And so before I turn it over to Anthena, who is the project manager at Elevate for the city, I wanted to say a couple quick thank yous. There was a huge group of City of Evanston staff that were involved in this project. I was certainly involved as the project manager, but our engineering team, we had architects, our fleet and facilities division managers and staff, our facilities staff. We even had many of our tradesfolk who were involved in helping do walkthroughs for some of the assessments. And this has been a really significant staff learning opportunity as well. And so although this strategy is going to be a written document, and there will be recommendations to City Council about how to adopt it, one of the biggest outcomes that we've been able to identify is just bringing staff's level of understanding and awareness of carbon neutrality practices and barriers into our learning experience. And so I just want to thank all the staff that have been involved and are demonstrating leadership in helping us get to this goal. So I also want to thank CNT and Elevate staff for their dedication, their hard work, and the ability to flex as we got this completed during a global health pandemic. It was no small task, and so I'm going to turn it over to Anthena Gore to keep us going. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumar. Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to talk to you specifically about, as Kumar mentioned, the last goal here on this slide, the carbon neutrality for municipal operations. And so our task here was to help the city of Evanston complete some core tasks that would help them get on the road to carbon neutrality. And the tasks that we specifically completed are listed here on the slide. And today we will be diving into the zero emission strategy. I promise you, at a moderate pace, not at the pace at which I flipped through the slides earlier. Okay, so first of all, what is carbon neutrality? We have a short definition here just for those that may or may not be familiar, and also giving some context to what we are about to explain in the zero emission strategy. The benefits, of course, are reducing energy use, reducing financial burden associated with that high energy use, healthier, cleaner environments, and better access to equipment options that help to induce that healthier environment, and definitely setting an example for citywide carbon emissions reduction. So the most wonderful part about this project was being able to work with the city staff to understand what their priorities are, their pathways to zero, and having a mid-sized city in Illinois really take a leadership position on this. And we were very grateful to work with the city of Evanston to talk about these goals. Speaking of their priorities, here again, seeking carbon neutrality by 2035, primarily focusing on eliminating those carbon emissions altogether through renewables and elimination of fossil fuels. So there are a variety of ways that you can get to zero, but these are the preferred pathways listed here. These were not prescribed by Elevate or CNT. These were things that came out of the city of Evanston, a wonderful list to have when talking to a city about, well, what way do you think you want to get to zero? Because they are the ones who are ultimately, as Kumar mentioned, going to city council, having those hard discussions, engaging with the community. So taking all of that into account really undergirds what we see here on this list. So as we begin to talk through the zero emission strategies that are going to be summarized here, and again, exposited later on in the document that we will be releasing later this month, you'll see that these strategies and preferred pathways are sort of framing up how the strategies are going to be implemented at the city level. Again, just for municipal operations and not across the community, as the municipality is seeking to set an example and then leading out into the community more of those implementation strategies and things that would help to improve the overall pathway to carbon neutrality. So again, we had the city of Evanston, all of those wonderful folks that Kumar mentioned that helped out, that contributed their time and insights, and then Elevate, which Lindy and I represent here on the call, and CNT, which Jen McGraw, who is a sustainability guru, really contributed a lot to the zero emission strategy as far as the fleet goes as well. So together we were able to put together a wonderful suite of things that the city of Evanston could implement and also take back to their city council and have internal meetings about what would it really cost to be able to get to a place of zero in their municipality, and what does that mean for doing it across the community in the future? So that is the big question, and we are going to dive into the big conversation now with Lindy Wertlaw to talk about the zero emission strategy.
Thank you, Anthena. Sorry about that. Thank you, Anthena, and thank you, Kumar, for the introduction. I just want to echo everything that's been said here. This project was an excellent one that working with the city team really helped us as we started to map out the strategies to really dig in with city staff, and does this pass the smell test, and how can we make this work over time? And so here is the zero emissions strategy. And today we're really going to provide an overview on the municipal greenhouse gas inventory, just the baseline, and then the roadmap to carbon neutrality. Next slide. So in 2018, in the 2018 greenhouse gas inventory, total municipal emissions were calculated at 21,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The majority of that, as you can see here, is really associated with electricity and natural gas consumption in the building portfolio. And then another 12% is connected to municipal fleet and 8% associated with streetlights. Next slide. In 2035, without taking any additional measures, municipal operations are projected to reduce by somewhat, and by about 23% from 2018 emissions. This represents about a reduction, I said 23%, and there's a number of factors that lead to this. And that's, of course, we know the grid is decarbonizing. We know there's a change in heating and cooling seasons. There's continued fuel efficiency improvements in cars. There's a number of things that are causing that. But of course, even as impressive as this is, it's certainly not anywhere near where we need to be in order to achieve the carbon neutrality goal for 2035. The next slide. So in order to achieve that goal in municipal operations, the city of Evanston really is going to have to commit to taking deliberate and aggressive steps to reduce energy consumption in buildings and streetlights, electrify buildings, reduce its fuel consumption, and offset any remaining greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So each scenario of the zero emission strategy, really all of them are aggressive and bold action. And that is really demonstrative of the city of Evanston's longstanding commitment to climate, the work that has gone back through most of this century. And any of the scenarios are going to result in a significant departure from the 2035 business as usual. But scenario one does represent the highest, most aggressive penetration of strategies and results in the lowest reliance on renewable energy credits and offsets to achieve carbon neutrality. Scenario two is still aggressive, but it does represent a lower penetration rate for strategies, less aggressive targets for vehicle miles traveled, and other targets, energy efficiency and electrification, and even renewable energy. And this scenario requires about 62% more of RECs and offsets than scenario one, but it is more aggressive than scenario three, which is the least aggressive, but I might add still aggressive, and it features the lowest penetration of strategies and requires about 41% more RECs than scenario two. Again, and I think I've said it several times, is that this really, all of these scenarios represent significant operational changes from 2035 business as usual. Next slide. Of course, any carbon neutrality plan is challenging, and Evanston certainly has some of its own. There's some constraints that we knew going in. So the city's water treatment plan represents about 40% of emissions. And it is already really quite efficient. So there's not a lot of opportunity to reduce consumption. And the city also is going to have to rely on natural gas, which is used for its backup generation until there are new technologies. And of course, the city will continue to explore what those might be. Secondly, when we're talking about electrification of buildings, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the strategies, when we get into the strategies, but it's going to result in a temporary increase in electricity consumption. And so that impacts the bottom line too. But as we know, as the grid gets cleaner, this effort to decarbonize or fuel switching really means that buildings will eventually benefit from a decrease in emissions. Next slide. So decarbonizing the grid is an external factor, which is going to take time, but in the interim, those electricity emissions can be mitigated by on-site or even off-site renewable energy. But in a nutshell, there's going to be, in 2035, there will be residual emissions, remaining electricity, natural gas, and even some fuel consumption that's going to have these leftover emissions. And this isn't actually uncommon in carbon neutrality plans, especially for municipalities that are charged with serving the public and offering services like water and other things. But so it certainly, regardless of whatever scenario is employed, is going to involve these offsets and renewable energy credits. Next slide. So we'll dig into some of the slides, some of the strategies. There are a total of 9 strategies, 5 associated with buildings, 1 for streetlights, and 3 for fleet. And we'll talk a little bit about them. Next slide. So right sizing is really is reducing municipal square footage. And it's really represents an immediate opportunity to eliminate energy consumption by retiring space that may not necessarily be needed by the city to serve the people of Evanston. And this isn't, you know, some notion of reducing half the buildings and suddenly you're not seeing the city in the way you're used to. Even a modest reduction in square footage can make a big difference. And really, one of the things that we've noted and talked about in our internal meetings as a project team is that as we're reemerging from the lockdown, or maybe we're headed back in, who knows? But this timing really represents, it's an opportunity to kind of assess what we've done in the past and think about, you know, our facilities and space utilization and how much do we actually need, and really thinking about that. And additionally, it really is an opportunity to talk about adaptive reuse and what does that mean for a community? And is there a better use for this municipal building in the community? And that can kind of represent positive changes in communities and set an example that prioritizes revitalization. So it's just, there's a lot of things to think about when thinking about right sizing and what will work for the city of Evanston. Next slide. So natural gas consumption, electrification is really about reducing reliance on natural gas whenever possible. And the reason for that is that natural gas consumption results in emissions that come directly from the combustion of fossil fuels. So the idea is to really eliminate that use as much as possible. It's a key element of carbon neutrality goals. And so electrification is a fuel switching strategy that replaces that. And that could be with hot water heating, and then cooking with systems, which is not typically as applicable to the municipal buildings. But electricity still has associated emissions. So, you know, as we've said several times, as the grid gets cleaner, this is an even better strategy, but for the time being would be supplemented by on-site and off-site renewable energy generation. Next slide. So energy efficiency, of course, as we noted, the energy consumption in the city's buildings represents the majority of municipal emissions at about 80%. And across that 80%, even the majority of it is actually electricity. So for this reason, it's really important that the city continue to assure that its municipal buildings, and equally as important, the people who work in them, are using energy as efficiently as possible. And that's a crucial component of the carbon neutrality plan. And Thina talked about some of the other elements of this plan. She just briefly showed it on the screen. And one of those was conducting 3 case studies, pretty in-depth case studies, to chart like what are the potential carbon neutrality pathways among those buildings. And we used the findings in those buildings to kind of offer a sample of what we can expect in the remainder of the city's portfolio. of buildings, and using that determine the assortment of energy efficiency strategies that include lighting upgrades, high efficiency heating and cooling systems, and building envelope improvements, such as air sealing and insulation. And all of those will result in significant reductions of energy consumption. Next slide. So Evanston right now currently maintains 2 on-site solar PV systems at the water plant and the senior center. But an initial analysis of the city's rooftop shows that there's a significant amount of rooftop space that could be used, up to about that will amount to about 4.6 million kilowatt hours. So knowing that, and also understanding that there is a decreasing cost in on-site solar, makes this an important part of the city's pathway as well. Evanston, as I mentioned, it could support up to about 4.6 million kilowatt hours. And so the strategies in each of the scenarios represents different penetrations of maximizing that space. Next slide. Of course, that on-site renewable energy certainly doesn't cover all of the city's electricity needs. So the city will also start to the city is already looking at off-site renewable energy and continue to expand on that. Additional solar, community solar it's growing a lot in Illinois. And the idea that Evanston really hopes to continue down the pathway on is that, making these investments close to home, also in addition to offering the efficiency, the emissions reductions, it also supports the local green economy. Next slide. And last but not least, among the buildings and streetlight strategies is streetlights. Evanston has about 6,000 streetlights. If you've been to Evanston, a good portion of them are the ornamental Talmadge lights that you see around town, about 4,200 of them, and the remainder are your more traditional Cobra lights, and there's about 1,800 of them. The city has already been on board with reducing consumption, and there's a 2018 streetlight master plan. And so the strategy in this plan kind of builds on that and ensuring that those are continued to, the city continues to go after them and continue to implement that plan. Next slide, I will turn it over to Jen to talk a little bit about the fleet strategies, another crucial component of the plan.
Thanks, Lindy. So I'm Jen McGrath from Center for Neighborhood Technology. One of the major things we did with this project was to assess Evanston's municipal fleet and look at the strategies that were a good fit for the vehicles and uses. And we started with Evanston has a good database of the existing fleet and its use, and we analyzed those data. There's more than 400 vehicles, and there's a lot of different types of vehicles. And so we started looking at what the best fuel technologies were for the different needs of the city's operations. Some of the recommendations we made were very straightforward. So the electric vehicle market for sedans and smaller vehicles is really developed, and we think it makes a lot of sense for Evanston to move forward with electrification of those vehicle types. And that's going to take installing infrastructure for charging. It's going to take some learning on usage and charging and maintenance, but the payback is really great. So they're a little bit more expensive to buy, but the fuel savings is significant and the maintenance savings is significant. We think that's kind of a no-brainer. But the next set of vehicles are these larger diesel vehicles. They might be construction equipment, fire trucks, all sorts of special uses, and there just are not electric options for those yet. So we looked at a variety of fuel types and technology types for those vehicles. And right now, Evanston uses about 28% of its fleet uses a B20 type of biofuel. So it's 20% biofuel. not yet carbon neutral. Full 100% biofuel requires special alterations to the vehicles. So that might be a pathway for consideration. Other parts of the country, especially the West Coast, are pursuing something called renewable diesel, which is generated from agricultural byproducts and other sources as a complete cycle to generate diesel fuel that's basically chemically the same as diesel fuel you buy at the pump, but as a carbon neutral option. There's not yet a great source for that in the Midwest. There's a plant being developed. And so the recommendation for these heavy duty vehicles is the developing market. There's a lot of cities working on this issue. And as Evanston moves forward with the electrification of the vehicles, that makes sense today to keep an eye on those markets. Plan for some sort of biofuel transformation, but maybe that's renewable diesel. And keep an eye out for any other kind of up and coming fuels that make sense, right? There are some places using hydrogen. Hydrogen right now is made often from natural gas. It's not actually carbon neutral unless it's very explicitly made from clean electricity. And infrastructure can be very expensive. So that's not like an easy yes right now, but it might be down the road and it's worth keeping an eye on. So happy to talk about any of these more specific technologies. One of the things we did look at very carefully is examples of other cities going electric for vehicles in cold weather, because we know that can affect performance, and it really does work. We talked to the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, we looked at Colorado, and it's working, and we think it's a good path forward for Evanston. The next strategy we looked at is the management of the fleet. So like I said, there's a good database of the fleet right now, but we think there's more that can be done. The first thing is that there's a lot of vehicles that have not a lot of mileage on them each year. And so one example in Seattle is setting a threshold of if a vehicle is not driven 200 miles a month, maybe you don't need it. Maybe you can figure out other ways to do that travel. Reducing the number of vehicles is a really good way to make this carbon neutral strategy pay for itself. If you're not buying a vehicle, you're not spending that money. So we really recommend a thorough assessment of how the vehicles are used and if there's ways to combine uses, figure out alternative modes that people could be using, reducing travel. I think, as Lindy mentioned, we've all learned a lot from this COVID era remote meetings that maybe we don't need all the travel. Beyond that, there were a lot of opportunities for thinking about procurement going forward and making sure that the vehicles Evanston does buy are the highest miles per gallon possible, and then tracking the use of those to make sure they're being used efficiently, plan route, think about carpooling where it's appropriate, think about maintenance improvements to keep the efficiency up. And then the next strategy we looked at is around getting the vehicle miles traveled overall in the fleet down. So like I said, there's a lot of ways to reduce trips. A lot of the trips in Evanston for the fleet are essential, right? You have important safety, you have important services, but there's ways to think about, are there ways to do that more efficiently? Can you plan days out where people don't have to travel as much? And can you promote these alternative modes and create a culture where maybe the car is the last choice for travel for a city business? And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Lindy. Like I said, I'm happy to answer questions on any of this. Post your questions in the chat, or we'll save them till the end.
Thanks, Jen. So next slide, let's jump into what this looks like with all of the strategies put together. And so what we see here is that the building, streetlights, and fleet strategies does result in a significant emissions reduction against the business as usual for 2035. And those reductions are about 26% at scenario 1, 20% at scenario 2, and about 15% at scenario 3. And as we see here, if we could go to the next slide, there's still significant residual emissions, particularly with electricity, and also natural gas you see here in the orange, which will have to be offset with renewable energy RECs and offsets, which is represented by the green line here. And so you see the increase in need for those across the scenarios. And again, over time, as the grid continues to decarbonize, electricity emissions will rapidly decrease. And future technologies we're expecting that those will also offer additional opportunities for more climate-friendly backup generation at the water plant, so that natural gas can be reduced even further. Next slide. So scenario one most closely aligns with the hierarchy of carbon neutrality priorities that Anthena talked about at the beginning, and that Evanston put forth at the beginning of this study. And it features the highest adoption rates for prevention of energy consumption by eliminating assets, right-sizing, electrification, energy efficiency, and both on-site and off-site renewable energy. So you see more renewable energy here that's helping reduce a significant amount of those electricity emissions. Scenario two still aligns with these priorities, but with slightly lower adoption rates. And while scenario three still reduces emissions, right sizing is somewhat out of the picture and has lower adoption rates of all of the other strategies. Next slide. Next slide. But in summary, all of the scenarios allow Evanston to achieve carbon neutrality with the purchase of RECs and other offsets. Next slide. So another purpose of the zero emission strategy was really to determine not only can we achieve carbon neutrality by 2035 and wanting to understand what the pathways are for achieving it, but we also wanted to understand the cost of that. And so we created a high-level cost estimate for each scenario that includes two types of cost considerations: one-time investment costs and then annual ongoing expenditures. The values are really meant to indicate a magnitude of cost and do not really replace the need for independent financial analysis on a project-by-project basis. So those will still have to happen. Next slide. So in thinking about the one-time cost investments, these are the largest costs, as you can see here. These involve infrastructure, construction and installation. It involves electrification and the efficiency construction, and all of those things. And the low end and the high end is quite a range. So the low end range is from 35 million to as high as 75 million. And again, that really depends on the varying degrees of penetration of the strategies, which result in different one-time costs associated with them. Next slide. So annual costs are the ongoing ones. And so we calculated both the costs and savings directly associated with the strategies. And so as we see right here, the added costs are due to increased electricity consumption and of course the purchase of RECs and other offsets. Next slide. Then there's overall savings related to the strategies too. So related to electricity and natural gas consumption being reduced and the reduction in fuel costs as well. So next slide. The end result of the annual costs is actually a net savings against business as usual. And this ranges from across the three scenarios from 1.4 million to 3.7 million between the three scenarios. Next slide. Oh, thank you, Anthena. And so this brings us to the end of presenting on the strategy, the zero emission strategy. And I think we're ready for questions. Or Kumar, if you wanted to add anything else.
Yeah, thanks, Lindy. We've been getting a lot of really good back and forth in the chat. I've been trying to type away as quickly as I can and respond to some of these, but I think some of these questions might be better asked verbally. I think the one of the ones that just came up is referencing a slide. And so Len was asking, he's asking about what % of the water treatment plant's natural gas use is associated with backup generation. And then it seemed like a follow-up question was he says, so that 40% left in the big blue box is just water treatment plant normal use. So do you know which slide we could go back to for that one? Maybe I can ask Linda. Unmute.
I think we're looking at this chart. So the natural gas is in orange. The blue is actually electricity consumption, much of it related to the water treatment plant, but other residual electricity as well. So natural gas is still reduced by quite a bit in the buildings, but there's still remaining natural gas. And what's here in scenario 1 is natural gas. So that is the natural gas associated with the water treatment plant. And scenario 2 and 3 include the water treatment plant and smaller amounts left in the remainder of the building stock because there's less emphasis on electrification and some of the other strategies, energy efficiency as well.
And Len, one of the other things that it's important to note is that blue box is showing electricity. The units are in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, but the assumption is that electricity use will be offset through a combination of offsite and on-site renewable energy electricity generation. But that there will be this residual, there will still be electric use demand. This is not just for the water treatment plant. This is for the entire municipal operations, even accounting for the increase in fleet electric demand, because that will actually show up in a building's energy use, unless it's electric vehicle charging equipment at a parking lot or something like that. Jen, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention there's this sort of odd nature of greenhouse gas accounting and reporting where you talk about electricity emissions 2 ways. So what this is doing is showing what's called the location-based emissions. So this is, we're plugging things into the electric socket. Some power plant somewhere is providing that electricity. This looks at that grid and says, what's the average emissions per kilowatt hour? The other way to talk about electric emissions, and cities are required to report both, is sort of a market-based method, right? So that is, you're procuring clean energy that is contractually yours, and it is equivalent to the amount of electricity you're using, and that's how you get to carbon neutrality. So in a sense, when Evanston executes this plan, this chart's going to get reported in 2 ways. One will look like this, and one will look like the blue bar doesn't exist because there'll be no emissions because all of the electricity will be procured as clean energy. And both of those are valid. Both of those are real. It's just part of the larger scheme of managing carbon from the electricity sector is that you have to report it both ways. And it's important to pay attention to both ways.
Thank you, Jen. So if folks have questions, I know we've got 2 on deck in the chat, but if you also want to, if you want to ask your question verbally, you can use the raise your hand function or just type into the chat and say, I have a question, can you allow me to unmute? But it looks like Alex has a question here saying, what is the cost of the kWh used in your calculations?
So we use the cost based on the cost that the city of Evanston is currently spending right now. And we used an average across the 3 buildings that we reviewed. We used an average a cost per kilowatt hour based on that. I'd have to look at what that exact number is, but.
And it's not just the supply portion, it's the full bill. It's basically the full ComEd bill cost, right? So it's including transmission, distribution, taxes and fees, all of that. And then it's breaking it down to a kWh unit cost that then is being multiplied back up to come up with the full annual cost and cost savings. I'm pretty sure I'm remembering that correctly.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, excellent. Len, I see your hand is up, but we've got first we're going to go to another question, or a question from Michael Drennan. Asking, can we revisit the slide on the ex-ante savings for projects per scenario? So Michael, did you have a question you wanted to ask there? I can go ahead and if I can get to you, I can let you unmute yourself here. There you go, Michael. You should be able to ask your question. Michael, are you there? Okay. If you're trying to talk, we can't hear you. So we're gonna go to Len and then we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Oh, Michael, I could hear you there.
You could hear me there. Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yep.
Gotta love the internet. Okay, so I was interested in understanding how the savings from these investments, these one-time investments I'm at, those streetlights last a long time. So some new streetlights, and I remember when they installed those, and it was dumb then. Okay, my 2 cents aside, was interested in understanding how the annual cumulative annual savings would assist offsetting these costs for the city, and if there's a ROI horizon elevates estimated for some of these investments, given that.
We have, I think we're talking about the annual cost slide, Anthena. But we did not do an ROI for this. We just chose not to do that at this juncture. The scenarios are meant to provide just a general snapshot of the pathways, but we know that in implementation, it'll probably be a mix of adoption and penetration rates. So we did not conduct an ROI based on these numbers.
And I can just add to that and say that one of the things that we want to be very clear about in the costs and the savings and the capital costs versus the operational costs that are provided, we as staff view these numbers as basically price signals and cost signals. So we think of these as ranges and magnitude, not as values that we are going to use in bringing an action to city council for a specific project. Each of these changes, or even buying a new vehicle, are going to require some cost verification, and for building facility assessments in particular, or changes to that may impact the building's envelope or other parts of the building, not just the HVAC, for example, are going to require some design and some engineering analysis to really understand the full scope. And so we found these costs to be really helpful in understanding magnitude and scale, right, and direction. What is the difference between the scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3, right? Are they really divergent in terms of cost and in terms of savings, so we can know which path we want to recommend to city council, or are they all somewhat similar, right? And so it's very helpful in understanding that difference, but not.
As a member of Citizens Greener Evanston Energy Task Force, our long-term goals are, of course, perfectly aligned with what you're presenting here. It's just a matter of ensuring we can organize effectively for that scenario chosen. And in so doing, having information available would assist us in taking this door to door and building support.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Michael. I think we're going to move on to Len here. Len, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, and maybe it's more of as we present this to more people, if you go back to the big blue slide, I see the big blue slide and you see the little green line goes down a little bit. And then, a few slides later, we're spending $70 million, more or less. And we still have a significant thing. It's just graphically, I'm like, oh, I'm spending $70 million and I still have a massive blue bar. So, but explain, and I think the site and the source is probably a piece that needs to be in here too, because that's true. But just graphically, I look at this and I'm like, whoa, I'm spending all this money and I'm just making like a dent. And it could also be the scale of this too, because it's what you guys had suggested. It's a pretty big capital investment, right? And it's not huge, but it's not insignificant either. And so I think the message we want is that you're going to try and spend this money, but the end result is zero. On the other slides, the zero is sort of really small. The zero is there, but at the bottom, it sort of sums out to be zero, because that's the thing, right? We want to say, hey, you got to spend some money up front, but the end result is zero. And so I see this slide and I'm like, I don't see zero. I see a lot still left. So I get it now. I get it.
Yeah, you don't know how much time we spent talking
Yeah,
about this.
I
So
know. It's a mess. It's a messaging thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can even see in I think the second slide that we put up there when we talk about community-wide emissions, we visualize it very differently, right? Because we recognize that that's primarily a communication tool, whereas this report is an analytical document, basically, right? It's not, it's what backs up the council action. It's what backs up the policy and the additional strategy work that will need to take place. But it's a really great point, so I appreciate you helping reiterate that, because I think it's something we need to be very conscientious about. I haven't seen any other questions come through the chat. Are there any other questions from folks? Again, feel free to raise your hand or put a comment in the chat. Be glad to get to you. While we're giving folks a minute or two here, I do just want to also thank, I believe we have at least one elected official on the call. So I want to thank Councilmember Ravel for joining us this morning and being a strong supporter of a lot of these types of initiatives over her tenure as a community leader, but also on the council. So, and to reiterate, we will provide copies of the slides and the recording of the meeting available. I'm going to put the link in the chat here in a moment for where the recording will be. It's actually going to be the same link as the short link for the registration for this, but I'll put it in the chat so folks can see it. I'm not seeing any other comments or questions coming through. So Anthena, I guess if I could pass it back to you, if there's any closing comments that you or Lindy or Jen would like to make.
Sure. Just before that, Michael Drennan, are you re-raising your hand? I just wanted to acknowledge that because I see it popping up.
I did, and it's possible, given the time left, this may be best explored in the parking lot. It was regarding the city's current partnership with Collective Resources, the waste stream, and possibilities for leveraging methane emissions from those waste streams to fuel our fleet. It's a 30,000 foot view question. So if there's perhaps a resource Elevate has exploring that, be happy to tackle it offline.
I can just mention, there are cities doing that, and it takes some steps. The fuel coming from the waste stream is not as pure as is often needed to run equipment, but it's worth keeping an eye on the evolution of that. Like I say, the future of the fuel for the heavy vehicles specifically is a little bit open, and I think that's one that's worth paying attention to. But yeah, often limitations are the infrastructure costs on that, and then getting the right kind of fuel out of it. But it's important to look at all the resources for sure.
I did want to underscore what Jen is saying too, in that, it'll be really important that the city continues to pay attention to emerging trends in technology. Things are fast changing in this space. And so it'll be really important moving forward to keep an eye on those things, particularly around fleet, but other areas of our strategies too, with buildings too. So I just wanted to underscore that importance, and it is certainly something that the city is well aware of, needing to stay on top of these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the type of things we're talking about here are really transformational, and Evanston's on the cutting edge of what anyone is trying to do. And that's why, some of these things will still need to get tried and tested and figured out in an operational sense. And I really have been pleased to be involved in this, because I think that Evanston's commitment to the scale of the problem is really just to be applauded. And I see them as one of the leaders showing other cities how to get this done.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it. I just dropped in the chat for those who can see it. The short link, it's the cityofevanston.org/planning for zero. That's where we're going to post the video later today. We will make sure to send it out to everyone who registered, as well as the, we'll include a link to the slides as well. But I hope everyone has a good rest of your week and your day. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.